Thanks for joining us. It is episode 170 of the podcast, and a special thanks to those who come back every week after week. As Dan and Ben will tell you, I'm not even doing that on a regular basis now. So we absolutely love that you are, and we're really privileged that you come back and listen every week. It's an absolute honour to be here. Don't forget to hit subscribe on YouTube, on your podcast provider. Go wherever you need to go to listen to us. And yeah. So, lads, we're doing this on a regular basis now. We're doing it and mixing it up. What have we learnt this week? What's been going on in the life of Dan and
Ben? Busy week. Really interesting stuff going on this week in terms of supporting a few schools. One school particularly who is just on their start on their journey looking at using technology in education, which they did a lot of stuff through the pandemic, but it's like a brand new opportunity to do that and embed that through now in the classroom. So I've been able to do that this week. Great shout out to Holy Cross and All Saints in Eccles in Manchester. Fantastic story of how they're trying really, really hard in a deprived community to give the best to young people. So that, yeah, I've really enjoyed that, and it was nice to be able to see the opportunities and the fact that the teachers threw themselves into that. What we all know from the pandemic and even before that, teachers are innovative and they're trying hard to do things and put outside the comfort zone. And so that's been a big learning for me this week.
Brilliant. Yeah, I spent 2 days in the hospital this week, which was unexpected.
Yeah, I don't know why I left then. It's not funny. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, it's my little boy, my 1-year-old had a bit of a nasty fall. So, but he's all sewn up. They've sewn his head back up, and yeah, he'd be good as long as apparently it was the best one of the best children's team in the northeast who stitched him up. So we're hoping for a very little scar. Bless him. So yeah, he's needed a lot of comfort the last few days.
Yeah, and speaking of kids, we probably hear mine starting to kick off. Hopefully not falling over and mum's just challenging, juggling 2 young children, putting them both to bed. But my week's pretty much been gearing up to fly out to Ireland next week, attending some conferences. Ireland is on a big journey around education, technology and transformation. And yeah, looking forward to engaging with some educators next week from universities, further education, colleges, and schools as well. So yeah, it's absolutely amazing. And speaking of schools, transformation and what we need to do, let's get in. So tonight's episode, we have 2 powerhouses of education who have written an epic book about our schools, which we'll get into today, and we've absolutely loved. It's probably the biggest book I've read for a long, long time, I'll be honest. It's enormous, but regardless of the size, don't let it put you. It's an absolutely wonderful book. So let's please welcome Sir Tim Brighouse and Professor Mick Waters. How are we both doing?
Well, I'm all right. I've moved from room to room to just keep up with the technology. As you all know.
I feel like we need to tell that story, Tim. We need to tell that story of.
Well, it is the most uncomfortable podcast I've ever tried to join. I mean, I've been to about 5 different locations because you lot alleged that my mouth was moving, but the words weren't coming out of my mouth.
Really, it was perfect, but we just let you play.
My fellow contributor is trying to butt in, and we'll let him in a second. But
you need to pay your internet bill, Tim.
He kept telling me when I sent him drafts for the book, you've got the right words, but they're in the wrong order.
Oh, wonderful. And good to see you again, Mick. Previous episode with us, what an epic one that was, and it's great to have you back, but discussing something a little bit different.
Pleasure to be here. Yeah, things are good. The book's being well received by most people, so that's reassuring.
Yeah,
you're not going to tell them about the one person who gave us a 1-star on Amazon, then, Mick, are you?
Don't need to now, Tim. You're doing it. But yeah, I think the episode 107, Mick, was around radical new education. The book is talking about all of those, and we're going to get involved in it. But for those people who haven't read it and need to read it, tell us the opening bit of the why about the book. What was the why? Why did you feel, Tim and Mick, it needed to be written and that story and that opinion told?
Shall I start, Tim?
Yeah, go on.
Well, Tim and I thought it would be interesting to trace the journey of schooling from 1976 through to the present day. 1976 had been a watershed year in schooling, when the Prime Minister, James Callaghan, had delivered a speech which brought to a head the questions that were being asked about schooling across the country, and sort of ended the period that came after the war of optimism and trust in public services, and particularly schooling. And we thought if we could trace the developments over the last 45 years, it would be really interesting to think, are we at the point where, after the pandemic, schools are moving into a different age, a different era? And we went about the book by, first of all, interviewing as many of the former secretaries of state that we could get. And we got 14 of the 16 who are still alive. And we were just going to use those at first, but then we started to move into other people like civil servants and ministers of states for schooling. And then we started thinking, well, maybe we should talk to people who've been in charge of Ofsted, and maybe we ought to talk to some head teachers and some people who run MATs, and we mustn't leave out local authorities. So gradually, the number of people that we interviewed grew, and we ended up talking to 108 people about their view on this 45-year period in schooling. And that shaped the book. Tim, do you want to talk about the ages of schooling and the way it sort of unfolded?
Well, if you like, yeah. But
Yeah,
we've
go on.
ended up, and we must get to the point where we end up with, because we might lose our audience the way we're going.
Oh, is it me? Oh, am I too slow again?
No, you're always slow, but you're steady. Steady, that's what you are. But no, we end up with a book. It's worth waiting for this bit of the podcast when we deal with the toxins in the schooling system and how to remove them. Toxins that get in the way of the teacher doing a good job. Because we start with saying, you know, that bit about there's the Gino quote, which everybody knows, which is, I've come to the frightening conclusion that I'm the essential element in the classroom. I can humor or humiliate. I set the climate, and my daily mood makes the weather. And we think that the teacher is the most important person. And so what we do in the book is look at all the issues that affect whether the teacher can make good weather. So we kind of look at things like school improvement and leadership of schools. We look at things outside the school that affect schools and whether they can do what they want to do, like governance and finance. I mean, are MATs the way forward, or aren't they? How do you secure a sufficient supply of teachers that are suitably qualified and then retain them rather than lose them? So we look at all those sorts of issues, and then we come up with our conclusions at the end. But I have to say, it was amazing to talk to all these people, because they were pretty honest. I mean, you should have heard Kenneth Baker and what he said about some of his successors, even in his own party. I mean, he wasn't polite about Gove's interventions, but we did think that 4 secretaries of state made a huge difference. One was Kenneth Baker, he was the one who introduced the national curriculum, and he set the tone for Ofsted being introduced by Charles Clarke, and he published exam results. They were going to be published. So he set up the market in education, really. And then, of course, markets create winners and losers. So we interviewed people who then had to intervene in order to put right the failures that are exposed by a market. And the second person who made a big difference, we thought, was David Blunkett. And he focused on school improvement, urban education, all that sort of stuff that's made a huge difference. And I was on the receiving end of that in Birmingham and London. And then there are 2 others we think made a difference. One is Ed Balls, because he was the one who was identified with the Every Child Matters agenda and looking at the whole child and the needs of the child. and the other was Michael Gove. And Michael Gove, if you remember, the first day he was in the DFE, he tore up those rainbows in the DFE's buildings, in sanctuary buildings, and really got us back to basics. So we've told the story in the book, and then we come up with the recommendations. Mick, what have I missed?
Well, one of the things that we observe in the book is the fact that these four had major impact, but their impact was so long-lasting that their successors and several successors later were dealing with the ripples of what they had created, sometimes good, and sometimes those toxins that Tim was talking about. And what we thought, what a strange job Secretary of State is. The average time that they're in post is 2 years and 3 months. And when you think that some of them were in post for 4 and 5 years, it means that several of them were in for just about a year and sometimes under a year. And we thought some people, like Justin Greening, for instance, we thought was really tuned in to making a difference in a big way, but she didn't have time to do it because she was into something else, or politics intervened in that way. So it was odd. Tim, we ought to correct the slip of the tongue there. It wasn't Charles Clarke who established Ofsted.
No, it was Kenneth.
Well, Kenneth Clarke claimed he did, even though he didn't.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Tell them the story about.
No. Well, I suppose I could. Kenneth Clarke. It was Kenneth Clarke, and it was an appropriate slip that Mick's pointed out, because when I spoke to him, and he was typically Kenneth Clarke, terribly keen on sort of football and cricket and jazz and things like that. And you remember he used to wear hush puppies and very casual and so on. And he said, well, of course I appointed Chris Woodhead. Now, some people will remember Chris Woodhead, but he was a figure not entirely loved as the head of Ofsted. And he said, I appointed him as the first head of Ofsted. So I said, well, no, you didn't, you know. You appointed Stuart Sutherland part-time. It was your successor who appointed Chris. Are you sure? He said. So I said, yeah. So he said, well, of course, I haven't thought about education for 20 odd years. So I said, well, are you sure you thought about it then? So he did laugh a lot. He was in good mood, and it was a good thing. So sorry about Charles Clarke, because Charles Clarke invented something much more important. He wrote a book called The Too Difficult Box. And his argument was that ministers who would stay such a short time often put the trickiest issue into a too difficult box, and it never gets solved. And I think he was on to a really important point, because there are loads of things that are in the too difficult box that people have never solved, but feel they ought to, but they're not going to stay long enough, or it's too difficult. And so it gets put off. And we've identified some of those at the end of the book.
I think it's really worth jumping onto here that you mentioned there about the average tenure was 2 years, 3 months. Most of them couldn't feel that they could do very much or make much impact, or it was too political, that if they made too much change, would the party back them? Would from an election perspective, even the fact of the argument around that Ruskin speech, like, was that the job of the Prime Minister to be able to speak like that? And then you've just said there about that too difficult box. It really feels like what you're suggesting, or what he's kind of, not necessarily what you're suggesting, but certainly what's coming out, is this idea of the job of the Minister for Education has been that's where the decisions have been made in that department, and schools are at the behest of that. There's all sorts of wranglings, that reasons why those decisions are made and why other decisions aren't made, and therefore, from a head teacher and teacher perspective, those that are on the ground, a lot of these people have been to education, but they've been in a very typical type of education in the schooling system that they've been in, and are they suited to making the decisions about the day-to-day running of a school?
That's a good point. And as well as talking to people, we read loads of autobiographies and records of ministerial statements. And Mark Carlisle, who was Thatcher's first education secretary, actually said he couldn't really understand why he was education secretary, because he never went to a state school, and he basically has no connection with the state system. But there he is, responsible for trying to help it to move forward or to take things on. In fact, our view is that many of them meddle too much and have far too much influence, in the sense that they create turbulence without thought for the consequence. So you get this lurch to one side or the other, depending on a minister's personal preference or choice. Or at the end of Michael Gove's tenure, the tension in the teaching profession was very, very strong, and Nicky Morgan thought she had to sort of deflect that tension and attention to something else. So she started to talk about character education, which became one more thing might be a good thing, but it became one more thing for teachers to deal with, on top of the repercussions of all the things that Michael Gove had brought forward. So the sort of tendency to meddle, carry their own agenda, play with a personal project, put things on the too difficult box, create a sort of frustrating image of the job of being Secretary of State, which is why one of our recommendations tries to address that. One of our 6 foundation stones.
Yeah, and who else can you imagine a job where somebody's given 6 hours notice, or at most 12, 24 hours notice of you're going to do this job? You've not applied for it. There isn't a job description. You walk in the next day, you've no experience for it. So apart from Gillian Shepherd and Estelle Morris, who've both been teachers and it showed, all the others, and this is true of all ministers in all the jobs they do, they walk in overnight and they get on with the job and they don't stay a long time. Well, imagine being in a school where the head comes in, having had no experience of doing it, is only going to stay a year or two and then go. I mean, it's not the ideal way of running things, is it?
So what do we do?
Not only that, many of the secretaries of state talk to us about their lack of belief in the DfE, the civil servants who were appointed to enable the Secretary of State to do the job effectively. So they neither trusted the advice they were getting from civil servants, nor did they trust them to enable the policy that they wanted to put forward. So if a school were as dysfunctional as the DfE and ministerial relationships were, there'd be serious questions about effectiveness of leadership.
There would, but it'd be by the DfE, which is worrying based on what you've just said.
Because what's happened over the last probably the last 15, 20 years is that number 10 Downing Street, the Prime Minister's unit, whatever you want to call it, has gradually exerted significant influence both on the DfE and on the minister, the Secretary of State, depending on the Secretary of State's sort of personal clout. So if the Secretary of State was dominant, the Prime Minister's unit, the delivery unit, whatever it was called at the time, carried out their wishes alongside other policy agendas for government. But where the Secretary of State was basically keeping the seat warm, they became organised by number 10, the delivery unit, central government. And it's that centralisation of the schooling system that is one of the things that we think is a blemish at the moment, along with markets and over-managed schooling. So the managerial, the markets and the centralisation is probably a summary of the age that schools have gone through since 1986, when Kenneth Baker brought in the national curriculum, SATs and GCSEs and all those other things.
I know in the book as well, you look at like that decentralisation, but how what do we do? Because the average school, the average teacher is just having to work within those conditions. But if the political system isn't going to change, are we just doomed to carry on repeating this type of failure with its ups and downs, mainly downs for the profession, until somebody brave enough in some political party that's in power decides to kind of decentralize education? How do you see it improving, I guess?
Well, one of the things I should point out is that we do observe that schooling has improved massively over the period of the book covers. There is massive improvement, but there are still toxins. But we do make a recommendation. Tim, do you want to talk about the framework?
Well, yeah, we suggest that you're never going to remove the power that the Secretary of State, but you might moderate it and make him more thoughtful in what they do. So what we're proposing is that there should be a schooling framework commission, I think we've called it, which is the idea would be you bring all the stakeholder groups in, teacher unions, there are church schools, there are multi-academy trusts, there are local authorities, there is the CBI, there's the teacher unions, there are all the various interest groups would sit on a commission, or their representatives would. They would run citizens' juries and take interest groups, and then come up with a 10-year plan. And the 10-year plan would be done in the middle of a parliament, and it would be always set in the middle of the parliament, so it isn't affected by an election coming up. And then once they'd produced the plan, the Secretary of State would be obliged, whenever they made a decision, to refer to that plan, and where it's in accordance with the plan would take credit for being in accordance with the plan, and where it was different, give very good reasons why it had to differ from the plan, so that it would act as a kind of an expert constraint, a bit in the way that in health we've got used to SAGE and other parties always giving advice that ministers have to be thoughtful about, and that's what we think should happen. I don't think you can remove the powers of the Secretary of State, but I do think some of them might be distributed better locally so that they would be devolved and delegated. And we deal with some of that in our recommendations at the end of the book. But just as a sobering thought, when I set out to be a teacher in the 1960s, I'm that old, the Secretary of State had 3 powers only: the removal of air raid shelters from school playgrounds, securing a sufficient supply of suitably qualified teachers, and approving the capital programme of local authorities so that they could open and close schools appropriately. Now the Secretary of State's got thousands of powers. I do mean thousands. So that there's been a huge centralisation. Indeed, to make a rather dramatic point, this English schooling system, as opposed to Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, which are different, the English schooling system is the most centralised of anywhere outside North Korea. That shut you all up.
Yeah. Wow.
And I mean, and also just to come back to the point being made about the question, which was how do you sort of control that pressure on teachers and that lurching behaviour of ministers? One of the things that we observe in the book is that Britain doesn't have a shared understanding of what education's for, and England has never had either legislated or agreed purposes for schooling. And so a new Secretary of State can move into office and decide his purpose or her purpose for schooling system is different from what went before, a different purpose for a different Secretary of State. So there's no wonder then that the strategies and the policies that they bring in, the powers that they bring in, reflect their personal observation and personal priorities. Whereas if there was an agreed set of purposes for the state schooling system, there would be something that challenged a minister who wanted to bring in, if you like, extreme powers, and I don't mean extreme in a really negative way, but ones that were very different from what was there before. So in the book, we do propose. We think there's a consensus about the purpose, and that consensus should be something that we really take heed of and build up into either legislation or a sort of a declaration of purposes that we say the nation subscribes to, and that some of the things that schools do, if they have time or if they feel they're allowed or if it matters in their community, should be given more credit than they currently are. And we should get a better balance in the learning experience of the pupils to fit them for the 21st century, for the challenges, the opportunities that these children are going to face in life, and the way they're going to influence the world in which they're growing.
Yeah, I agree with all that.
So thinking on this, then one of the things that you talk about, and the phrase that you use is about making sure that you mentioned it there, Mick, the post-Thatcher age of market centralisation and managerialism. So we've kind of touched on a little bit of the centralisation. Maybe there's a little bit more to go there. But in terms of like markets and managerialism, why do you think that the influence of those things, including like inspections, league tables, or all those 1,000 powers that you were talking about, why do you think we need to kind of, what's the option to that? What's the alternative?
Well, those things that you just mentioned, like inspection and league tables, are part of a sort of suite of things that have developed since 1976 and have accelerated at different times. So things like governors being introduced into schools in 1977, 78, the appraisal processes that were brought in to try and get head teachers to think about the role they were doing in a different way, the SATs, the GCSEs, the league tables, the inspection regime, all these things are trying to shape the profession. And it depends where you look at it from. Some would argue that it's bringing consistency. Others would say it's bringing conformity. We think the danger is that it becomes over managerial, because on the back of all those sorts of developments, you've got inspection, which is very, very punitive and very high stakes, creating a sort of anchor on the system. It's holding it back. And the inspection regime is one of the areas that we spend a lot of time thinking about and talking about, but we don't think there should be an end to inspection. We just think it needs to be more moderate and more sensible and more pointed to helping schools to develop and improve, rather than simply casting judgment. And we've got lots of questions about the current inspection regime, supported incidentally by many of the people that we talk to. So the one thing all the secretaries of state agreed on, whichever party they were from, was that the Ofsted inspection was a good thing and we should leave it as it is because we can trust it. Whereas nearly every other person that we talked to had serious doubts about Ofsted, including some previous senior HMI, the heads of Ofsted, who were, Sir Michael Wilshaw was in fact quite open about his concerns about inconsistency, his concerns about the effectiveness of some of his inspectors, and concerned about the reliance on data. So our problem in terms of managerialism is that the climate in which teachers and schools are working is influenced by this sort of machine which sought to bring a sort of managerial model into education, and has had an effect which is negative. There's a poem by Swift which is it goes, little fleas have big fleas upon their back to bite them, and big fleas have bigger fleas, and so on ad infinitum. And what we've got at the minute is the teacher at the bottom of the chain, checked on by a head teacher, who's checked on by the leadership of the local authority of the MAP, who is checked on by a power that be, Ofsted, who was checked on by DFE. You know, the people checking on each other means that the natural reaction is to keep proving that you're doing what's expected. So you build an evidence base. And if I hear another teacher telling me that the reason children are doing things is so they've got evidence, it just is so sad, really, for the system. Sad for children. If children are simply evidence, if children are simply evidence producers, it's a funny sort of reason for having a school.
Sorry, Tim, I keep muting you because we're getting a bit of feedback, but you're good to go.
Okay. Yeah, well, I agree with all that Mick's just said. And I wondered why I was being muted in that way, but I understand the problem of the feedback. So mute me whenever you feel like doing it.
Okay.
I mean, does that mean I'll be allowed to speak anymore? I mean, our proposals for change are that, for instance, we would get rid of the rather unhelpful categorization of schools. And incidentally, there's a thing called a Hampton report, which came out a little over 10 years ago, which was meant to limit regulators so they couldn't grade what it was that they were regulating. So Ofwat doesn't say join Eon because Eon's whatever it is. They don't do that. So we think that get rid of the categories. Clearly, you've got to identify failing schools, but every other school would have and publish each year a balanced scorecard of what, the commitment of the kids. There are ways of doing that, the experiences they've had, how well they're doing on developing staff sicknesses, etc. There are loads of data you could produce to give a balanced scorecard of how well schools were doing. And we think that if schools work in partnerships, and we're all in favour of partnerships for the future, then the local partnership for school improvement, if that were a multi-academy trust or a group of local partners of schools that were run by the local authority, but we ought to return to that, they would say one school that should be inspected. Ofsted would say another one. And for each one, the partnership would say how they rank that school. And then what would happen would be that Ofsted would check whether their views of those schools were the same. So instead of at the moment it being a system which Steve Mumby described as the direst and fiercest accountability system in the world, with the direst consequences for the leaders in schools, it would become a much more developmental inspection system. And we think that schools should also be accountable locally because they contribute to the place, and they could attend, each local authority would have and do have a scrutiny committee. And so the partnership would report there so that there's a bit more of a democratic input. So that's what happened in terms of inspection.
Are you struggling to manage your school's Chromebooks and looking for a solution?
Check out the Vault episode with the team from Visor for features and why it can make a difference to managing your devices.
Visor integrates with the Google Admin Console to keep track of your Chromebook inventory and repairs. For an exclusive Edufuturists offer for 20% off for your first year, go to visor.cloud/edu. That's VIZOR.cloud/edu.
Daniel, mute.
We're just talking about that.
I think Tim's just muted you, Dan.
He's got his revenge. Is Tim still there?
He's in the background. He will return.
Yeah.
He's probably just moving to the 18th room. I'm interested to go. It's like the White House where Tim lived. It's absolutely enormous. Or is it that we're just spinning around looking for the planters? That's a joke that we had before we started. But go on, sorry, mate.
Yeah, no. I'm just thinking about that. It's what you said before, Mick. Really, the consistency versus conformity. And do we? And I know Tim there was talking about how it could be done in terms of still having that accountability and having a different process. Do we lose if we? I suppose if we scale down the conformity, do we lose the consistency? And is that is that a bad thing? Is that a good thing? What's your thoughts on that?
Well, I think that there's a definition to be made about what we think consistency is, and consistency surely begins with clarity of purpose, commitment to those purposes, and then being able to demonstrate the effectiveness of the achievement of those purposes. And how you actually do it does not have to be uniform. It's for you to demonstrate that the way you're doing it is effective and healthy. And where we've got to in the system is that the pro forma and the standardized way of approaching things is starting to dominate a lot of aspects of school life. Everything from the way teachers are observed in their teaching, things rush through the system. Somebody seems to get a way of doing an observation that seems to gain favor, and it spreads very quickly as people pass on the silver bullet or the answer or the sticking plaster or whatever it is. And pro forma driven formulaic teaching isn't in the best interests of children. Formulaic lessons now dominate a lot of schools because leadership demands a formulaic approach to make sure we don't miss out any of the so-called essential features of a good lesson. And we're so busy doing the essential features, we don't really have time to teach. So, it's absolutely imperative that children understand the objective of what they're being taught, that they're helped to understand the reason for it. But does that mean that they all have to write it down at the beginning in order that the lesson can begin with everybody out writing down a learning objective or a WALT or whatever you call it? No, it doesn't really, because sometimes it's easier and more effective and more efficient to reveal the objective at the end of the lesson when you've studied or experimented or made or produced something to follow it through. But the formulaic nature takes over. I mean, before lockdown, I spent a lot of time in schools, and I'm just getting back into schools at the moment. The number of primary children who are writing their WALT, and you say to them, "What's a WALT?" And they say, "Well, it's a WALT. I mean, I'm just doing my WALT." And you say, well, what is one? And they don't realise that it was, WALT, we are learning to, was actually characterised by a little chap called Walt in the 1990s, and he had a mate called Wilf. A lot of teachers don't know about Wilf, and that was.
I remember Walt and Wilf.
Yeah, Walt and Wilf. Wilf was what I'm looking for. It was what the teacher was looking for, and the Walt was the child's interpretation of that in order to clarify the objective. But it took over to such a great extent that the person who invented Walt and Wilf, she thinks it would be a good idea if they immigrated. They were never intended to be this sort of burden at the start of every lesson. I mean, it's not in the book, but a few years ago, I measured with a tape measure the learning objectives of some children in Key Stage 2 and sort of calculated the average amount that children write on these. And we found that in Key Stage 2, in the schools that were in this study, children were writing 1.6 kilometres of learning objectives. And when you think of it that way, it's an incredible amount of time spent writing things that they very rarely return to. It's great to have the objective, but if in the lesson you never return to it, you simply got it there in case somebody senior to you, one of the big fleas, comes around to ask about it, then it's a sort of defensive teaching rather than a teaching style and approach that brings it forward. So when you talk about consistency and conformity and uniformity, which is even worse, I think it's about clarity of purpose that sets us off, and processes that enable that clarity of purpose. And that's the debate we should have. A profession debates. It doesn't move in a way that's pushed along by others. And that's why in the book at one point we talk about head teachers of schools being treated and sometimes acting like branch managers and treating the staff of the school as operatives. And the worst excesses are where children are sort of seen as units of production. How many GCSEs at 7 have you got? What's your SAT rating going to be? What we want to know is how well the child's doing in progress towards the objectives that we've got for that child in our school overall. So I think it's about getting things in perspective and really thinking. And what we We think at the end of the COVID pandemic, because it's moving on into an endemic situation, that schools are now ready to embrace a new era of hope, ambition and collaborative partnerships. And we should do everything we can to encourage that. And it might take a few years to get going, but we think there's a sort of a pent-upness in the system at the moment, ready to move forward and take things on.
Yes. I think we're all racing to unmute ourselves. But I was that 1.6 kilometers of learning objectives. I love these stats, by the way. I think that they're really important. But just to consider that as a reflection on what we've done, and I love that you challenged the concept of uniformity. And I wonder whether we want uniformity or some sectors of education and education politics want uniformity because it's easy. Because it's easy to manage uniformity, isn't it? Because if everybody's got to wear their skirt length a certain way, or everybody's got to do a certain amount of subjects, and everybody's got to do a certain amount of elements of a lesson plan, or what that makes that outstanding, it's almost easier to manage. But then that comes back to the thing that you were talking about managerialism and the whole concept of it. It fits nice into a performance table. And on this podcast, we talk heavily, and I know we're not on our own, about the power of performance tables and how powerful that they can be. But they're only really good if you're at the top of them. And then it creates a divide, doesn't it? And but it's whether it becomes it because it fits into a you've done 10 things. Those 10 things equate to this. That then equates to this performance table, and that performance table says you get this much funding, and then you get this because you get this many students. But what you're talking about here is a little bit different than that. You're talking about it doesn't need to be about that uniformity. There's a level of hope, ambition, and collaborative partnership that you talk about there. Really, just gives an opportunity for something different.
And absolutely. And I mean, you just said about the performance tables. One of the challenges we issue in the book is to do with the fact that the performance tables don't actually measure performance of children. They measure performance of pupil against a norm. And one of the things that emerged in the book and the interviews with Secretaries of State and others was that there's little understanding of how the exam system or the testing system works, very little understanding of norm referencing as opposed to criterion referencing. And one of the things we try to expose in the book is the sort of the cracks in the exam system that are at risk of being papered over yet again after the experience of the pandemic. Tim, do you want to talk a bit more about the exam system?
Well, yeah. I mean, it was interesting that both Kenneth Baker and David Plunkett probably did make huge difference. Both of them agreed. I mean, I think that Kenneth Baker called it an antiquated exam system that's unfit for purpose. And David Plunkett said, well, if I'd only known about norm referencing, I would have changed things. But our exam system is shot. I think that was the phrase he used, and that we really must change it because it isn't right. I mean, at the moment, most secondary schools will be worrying about Progress 8. And Progress 8 is designed to put people on the wrong side, as many people on the wrong side of the average as on the other side. So it's for as many winners, you've got to have as many losers. And this is a balmy system. I mean, there was an outrage, if you remember, in 2020 because of Ofqual's algorithm, which was a rogue algorithm. Well, all we've got now, I mean, they use algorithms every year, but now they're hidden. So everybody says it's marvelous. We've gone back to a system that works like magically, but it's a hidden system. Exam marking is never published. So when you appeal, somebody else looks at the paper and says yes or no, you did get whatever you're meant to have got. So it is a shot system. It reminds me of a lovely poem I came across, worth reviving, in America. A guy called Mike Buscemi. I heard him speak, and when he gave this poem, I said, "Hey, I'll have that poem." So he said, "Well, only if we trade poems." So I had to give him my poem. But the poem was called The Average Child, and it goes like this: I don't cause teachers trouble. My grades have been okay. I listen in my classes. I'm in school every day. My parents think I'm average. My teachers think so too. I wish I didn't know that, because there's lots I'd like to do. I'd like to build a rocket, have a book that shows you how, or start a stamp collection. Well, no use in trying now, because since I've found I'm average, I'm just smart enough, you see, to know there's nothing special that I should expect of me. I'm part of that majority, that hump part of the bell, who spends their life unnoticed in an average kind of hell. So even if you have norm referencing that has a big middle and a small top and a small bottom, the rest are left in an average kind of hell. And if you fiddle with it, so the right number pass that you've decided, but you only decide the pass mark after people have set the exam. And that's what happens with SATs. That's what happens each year with GCSE. Well, you're also not giving any idea as to what standards really are. And that's why Mick and I say we need criterion reference tests. We think exams, experiences and challenges, okay, agree them nationally, but let them be locally set, moderated, locally marked, moderated regionally, and let every school or group of schools through the Chartered Institute of Educational Assessors have a license to assess and some lead assessors. And let that be the system that we have in exams. Let people accumulate exams. So instead of all having to do them at 16, I mean, what would happen if everybody had to take their driving test at 18? And
On the same day.
On the same day. Everybody had to do that. It'd be nonsense. Let's have exams taken when people are ready to sit down, criterion referenced, and at 18 rethink a kind of publication of what I've achieved in all sorts of respect in schools, including a mix of the vocational, the academic, a baccalaureate of some sort. That's what we need there. And again, the principle of nationally set, locally marked, moderated could be the way to go. And that would introduce trust in teachers, which would be moderated externally, validated through a chartered assessors. And by the way, it would be cheaper than the exam system we've got at the moment, which delivers profits to 3 exam boards of an enormous kind and eats into a huge sum, running into hundreds and hundreds of millions of pounds of a valuable school's budget. So we do propose some answers to get rid of some of the toxins in the system.
Wow. And by creating this and by pushing this, I just kind of had in my head of, if you give Wi-Fi free to every individual and put it on every lamppost in this country, what fee would that generate by the people that make money from that system of charging for that on mobile phones and internet, everything else? It would be exactly the same as what we would get from the people that are generating the hundreds of millions of pounds, because their vested interest is to keep generating the £100 million on a regular basis. So it's how do we then shift that? Is that the responsibility of the government? Is that responsibility? Who drives that forward?
Well, that's back to your purposes again now, because if one of the purposes of education is to give every youngster the opportunity to demonstrate what they can do, and in different contexts with very, very well moderated approaches, that's different from we're using the exam system to hold people to account every year by measuring one school against another in a competition. People think we're assessing students. What we're actually assessing are the the so-called effectiveness at schools of getting students through exams. And that's why you get gaming in the system. It's why some children don't read a play. They simply read the speeches, which are a banker for the exam that they're going to face. It's where the teacher tries to second guess the managerial system they're in. I understand why teachers do it, but children themselves then start to think that learning is about snippets of information. Learning is about fragmented information, fragmented bits that you can spit at a paper in the exam session rather than really enjoying the work. That's why two of our stepping stones that we propose are actually to do with recognising what children can do. We propose one programme for every child in the country called STEPS, that they would do twice, first steps at the end of primary and some further steps in the secondary sector, where they basically do a project that's funded in a small degree by the state, and they follow something that they're really interested in, compared to do with their community, the environment, the society in which we live, and so on. And they present what they've learned to an adjudicator, somebody who's going to take notice of it and give them feedback, so that they learn more skills than simply turning up an exam. And we also promote a program called STEPS, Seeking Talent and Extending What Children Can Do, when they show an interest in something at the right point in maturity. So every child would get access to the STEPS scheme, where they would work with somebody who can bring out their interest and move them forward, but not all in the same year at the same time. 20% of children every year from year 5 through to year 8, a different 20%, so that by the end of it, every child, regardless of their need, regardless of their ability, has the chance to shape their own learning with expertise from the pool of teachers that are available that really push it on. And we think some schemes like this, which are assessed based on what children are doing and responding to what they're doing, rather than set these hurdles to jump over, and even if you jump over it, you're then told that the hurdle was too low this year, so you still failed. We think those sorts of things are not what are helping children, and they actually give a false image. And we think they have long-term side effects for children who come out as what is often called the forgotten third, the youngsters for whom the school system seems to bring no excitement and little benefit. So I think there are proposals in the book, recommendations in the book of how you can address some of these things. You take the toxin out and you substitute it with something purposeful and worthwhile.
I love that. I know I've said I've loved that 3 times tonight, because I do. And that idea of, we've interviewed Rob Horban from the Agora School in the Netherlands, you're probably aware of, and obviously conversations with the XP School, School 21, and a lot of these talk about that level of, and you're not talking about a full curriculum of project-based learning, but there's a suggestion that we can put project-based learning into it, around student choice and bit of agency, and then let's just see what happens, because like you just never know. Like, we talk about some of these huge companies that do that 20% time, and work with and some of the great things that have come out of that. Gmail was an example of a 20% project in Google. Lots of other options as well, and examples. I think as we get into this idea about proposals for the future, you talk about roles around changing in governance. You talk about it in terms of Ofsted, and I know that's something that is definitely on both of your hearts. It comes out clearly throughout the book. Is about exclusion in schools and a job that needs doing there, because we are not just the forgotten third that you're talking about there. We're talking about people whose lives get just get ruined, don't they? And we've got a job here to do something about that. So I wondered, Tim, maybe start with you, and then if you want to add on to it, Mick, just give us your thoughts on that part.
Yeah. Well, Ben, the stats here are alarming, and they shocked in our research, we kept checking with each other that we got it right. And when we interviewed people, we gave them the stats. And the stats are that in 2018-19, 7,853 kids were excluded from England's schools. Now, you may say, well, okay, fine. If you look at Scotland, which is exactly a tenth the size of England, the number of kids, well, if it was 7,853, you'd expect 785 to be excluded in Scotland. But they didn't exclude 785. They didn't exclude 78. They didn't exclude permanently, we're talking about. They didn't exclude 7. They excluded only 5 children permanently in 2018-19. Now, this caused us to start looking at, well, what the hell are they doing in Scotland that's different from England? When we put that to almost every one of our witnesses, bar one, they didn't seem to know the contrast. And if they knew, they hadn't been to Scotland to find out why. We think there's a complex series of reasons why. They haven't got a behaviour czar who boasts, well, doesn't boast, but whimsically says, well, I learned some of my skills by being a bouncer in the nightclub. So they don't start off on the premise of assertive discipline and zero tolerance. They don't talk about discipline and behaviour. If you look at the language they use, it's about relationships. And it's much more positive than it is negative. So the assumption is that things are going to work well. So, whereas in England, the reverse is the case. The assumption is that it won't work well. So you begin to have a culture which has grown over the last 10 years. Before the last 10 years, exclusions were in decline. In the last 10 years, they've gone the other way. Our curriculum's become narrower. We've talked about our assessment system, and we believe that the conventional wisdom around discipline in schools is assertive discipline and zero tolerance. And we think that is particularly harsh on kids with special educational needs and disabilities who are trying to fit into the mainstream and may have moments when they need to go out, when they need peace and quiet. And the clever schools, of course, all do it. But nobody has really analysed why is this difference between Scotland and England. Okay, there may be some data that's wrong, but there is a difference, and some researchers have looked at those differences, and we highlight those within the system. So there are lots of things we propose within the book to make our system more inclusive rather than predisposed to being exclusive, including what we've been talking about, the exam system and the curriculum being too narrow and the formulaic approach to teaching, etc., etc., all of which leads you to one size fits all. And if there's one thing we know about teaching, at least I painfully realize it, and that is you think something's going to work. It's worked 9 times out of 10, and then one day it doesn't work at all. And it's either down to you or it's down to the kids or a particular kid. You really, in teaching, you know only too well that one size does not fit all, that you need to adjust and you need to make changes in what you're doing if you want kids to be motivated, committed, and succeeding. And that's why, by the way, within the whole system, back to a bit of the conversation we've had, you know, if you talk to head teachers or heads of department, one of the dilemmas is, are we all going to sing from the same song sheet on this particular issue? And it is the most urgent issue in the system. And my fear is that that is something that at the centre, through DFE and a very centralised system, they don't consider at all. They think one size does fit all and that they can prescribe what needs to happen. So we feel very strongly that this leads to some very undesirable consequences. And we look in one chapter at the issue of admissions, attendance and exclusion, and expose issues that need to be tackled together. Mick, you may want to add to that.
Well, on top of Tim's figures for permanent exclusion, we have to remember that there are recorded in the same year 421,000 days lost to education for temporary exclusions or suspensions, as they're called. And that's enough to fill 3 secondary schools for a whole year, 3 average size secondary schools for a whole year. But of course, what that also doesn't show is the number of what you might call informal exclusions, where youngsters are recommended towards home education or some version of the basically don't come to school. And this is becoming bigger than people realize, and it's an actual problem in so many ways that we've really got to do something about it. I don't believe any head teacher excludes youngsters with anything other than a heavy heart. I think they do really think about it carefully and take the step that they take. But actually, sometimes we've incentivized the wrong things. That the things we were talking about earlier, the kudos of the exam results and the impact, therefore, of Ofsted, does mean that it's in our interest to get the right children to take the exams and the other ones not to be there. And I don't think people calculate that so much as let it happen. But too often over the last 20 years, children have been recommended to the school down the road where there's greater expertise to deal with their issues, and parents have taken the hint and gone there. The fact is the school down the road's full now, and it's overflowing, and some children are being lost to the system. When they're lost to the system, the problem then is they're at risk because of the people they meet beyond the school and beyond what we would want in society. So they are at prey to county lines, they're at prey to people who encourage them into gangs, they're at prey to people who encourage them to break the law, they're at prey to anybody who wants to groom and do the sorts of things that none of us would wish for young people. So how can that be good for a society to allow some of our children to be lost so early in their lives, when what we should be doing is working out how to encourage these children into healthy pursuit, into feeling good about themselves and the contribution they can make, however limited it is. But it cannot be good to abandon some children from the school system.
Well, Mick, one of the things that Michael Gove said about it all, if you remember, was that it was a necessary evil. And I agree it's an evil, but it can't be so necessary in England that for every child excluded in Scotland, 1,500 are permanently excluded in England. And as Mick's just said, that's not counting the ones cancelled out by the head to go to another school. It's not the ones that are off-rolled. It's those that are permanently excluded. It's not the 3 secondary schools. And incidentally, one of our ministers said that they would ban fixed-term exclusions, because quite often fixed-term exclusions, we have one witness, a head of a primary school in London, who said to us, well, when I got to the school, I got rid of the red zone and the green zone and the golden zone. And we said, well, what were they then? So she told us what they were, and clearly the red zone was where you got to before you were sent home. And when she arrived and got rid of it, one of the little kids came up to her and said, hey, miss, why have you got rid of the red zone? So she explained why. So he said, well, I'm really sad because I always wanted to get to the red zone because then I would get sent home.
See, we think that the move towards the managerial approach to what's called behaviour, discipline, whatever, so you get behaviour ladders, consequence ladders, whatever schools call them these days. Basically, you say to teachers, if this happens, you must do this. And children move up this ladder. The problem is that the teachers are addressing the consequence and doing as they're told, when actually what you need them doing is addressing the antecedents, the things that are creating the behaviour that's not healthy. And teachers, if you're not careful, become de-skilled. They simply become good at managing the process of moving the child to the next rung of the ladder. And eventually they become somebody else's problem when they get nearer the top of the ladder, and then they fall off into oblivion. We really need teachers to be helped to build the skills necessary to deal with children and help them to overcome the problem. But they're being de-skilled rather than helped at the minute.
And what you're not saying here, and for those people who will be listening to this and thinking, oh, right, so you're suggesting that we should just let this behaviour happen and whatever else. That's not what you're saying at all. What you're saying is that we skill up teachers on managing complex behaviour. You're not talking about removal rooms in that sense, unless they need to be. We're talking about a wider upskilling to deal with these complex behaviours. So in that sense, what's the alternative for serious, not serious offences, but serious behaviour, or some of the issues around that permanent exclusions are for? How would schools address that? Because that might just be a nice practical way to kind of bring it to a close.
Well, I think one thing is to rethink alternative provision. I mean, one of the enormous changes, and make the curriculum much more suited to the kids rather than a preordained, terribly biased towards academic blueprint that everyone must follow. So we need to do that. I'm not suggesting that the permanent exclusions aren't necessary when somebody shoots somebody or has a knife and uses that knife or whatever may be the case. Of course, something like that would require it. But let's have a look at what they're doing in Scotland, and they've got a different curriculum and a different approach. And my view is we should learn from that.
Tim, I think, Tim, you've muted yourself. Yeah. I tried to unmute you, but it said I couldn't because you'd muted yourself.
No, he's just doing that thing where he mimes again. He likes to do that.
I must say, this must be you must have very patient podcasters who watch and hear this. Go on, Mick, you go on.
Well, I mean,
all I do is mime.
Well, another aspect is of course, to be working with the family and trying to develop the way in which families are involved in education. And we pay particular attention to early years and trying to address some of the issues that eventually lead to problems for children in the early years stages. And we do refer to Andrea Ledsam's recent report about the first 1,001 days of childhood and the way in which family hubs, some of which some people would say are like Sure Start Centres reinvented, but she was very strident in saying they're not. And in a sense, we don't mind, as long as there's that provision for children and their families in that early stage of life. We think that will reap long-term benefit. But we understand that doesn't change the situation for somebody tomorrow who's got a child causing the sorts of problems none of us want. But what we do think is there's a long-term solution as well as the shorter-term things that we need. We do think that, personally, I think that even the phrase alternative provision is something to be looked at, because the minute you suggest it's alternative, you can't cope with the main provision, therefore you can have an alternative. It sort of implies it's second rate, whereas all children ought to be having a rich curriculum that's applied. Just because some children are prepared to swallow gruel doesn't mean it's healthy and really good for them. It simply means that they conform. And there are many, many children not really enjoying school. Why is it when children finish GCSE, so often they walk out saying, I'll never have to study that subject again? Thank goodness for that. We've taught them for 11 years to the point when they can't tolerate it anymore, and we call that a success. Now, we've really got to look at what we're offering children in the broadest sense. And as Tim said, to try and learn from other places and set ourselves some, I mean, we've been in a managerial approach has been ridden with target setting over the years. Why don't we set ourselves some targets that said it can be better than this for some children, and really incentivize the right thing? I should just finish by saying there are some fantastic teachers across this country who, bend over backwards to make children have the opportunity to fit in, to do everything they can to think about that child. And I know children, I actually know children who are really sort of overwhelmed that their teacher has thought of them over the weekend and brought something for them because they thought they would like it. I've found this book and I know you're interested in engines, so I brought it for you. If you think you'd like it, you can have it. And these teachers who ever so subtly demonstrate to a child that they do matter and they really are important to them, and it's the child that matters rather than their score. I think there are, hundreds of thousands of teachers like that. And so our criticism is about the system, not the teachers. Our criticism about the way in which we've incentivized the wrong things and sometimes applauded the wrong things and sort of held them up to be really good approaches, when the detrimental side of those approaches is something that we really can't condone. Somebody else is on mute now.
Yeah, Dan's muted.
God, that's the second time.
15th, I think, tonight.
Tim, you've passed it on to me.
Well,
I think that was a lovely way to end it, Mick. I think it's not criticism of the teachers, is it? It's like you said. Let's set ourselves a target of how we can do this better, and I think they don't need to look any further than this wedge of a book that you guys have put together, where I've noticed you brag about all of the famous people you know as well on the front, which is quite handy. But yeah, if you've got a spare couple of years, get yourself into Tim and Mick's book. It's great. It's brilliant.
Yeah, I read it on holiday. I read it in 4 days on holiday.
You can get it.
We did say we only wanted people dipping into it, so there you go.
It is interesting. In the first chat, in the introduction, it says we're not intending you to read the whole book. Dip into chapters that you find particularly interesting, and yet we've had loads of emails from people saying they started at the front and read it front to back, and many people have sort of delighted in remembering instances and circumstances and happenings that they remember from their teaching career at various points. So there maybe is a nice story. There's plenty of anecdotes in it as well. Which,
yeah, there are.
Yeah, some of which are very well. We think they're funny. We laugh when we were writing them. So,
I laughed when I was experiencing them.
Yeah, and sometimes not.
I'll tell you what I think to end on is it's mistakes. We've made loads of mistakes, both of us. And actually, if you go into a classroom and you've got a teacher when you're a kid, and the teacher says, "Tim, you've made 5 mistakes. That's wonderful. 5 opportunities to learn. You know you're in good hands." And so mistakes are there to learn from, and we've made plenty. And we've tried to learn from them in the book.
Yeah, I think that stands out, doesn't it? Like you're putting forward ideas based on your experience and based on all the people that you've interviewed for this book, and it comes across as humble. I think it's not somebody on Twitter or wherever going, "This is how you must do it," because we get a lot of that. If you're on Twitter, you get that every day, all day, every day. Very dogmatic views, especially over the last few years. Very dogmatic views, but actually, it's 2 guys who are saying, "You know what? We've been in this business a long time, and can we do something better?" Because it's ultimately affecting our children, and they're the people we should be investing our time in making things better for. So yeah, get it on Amazon. Just don't leave a 1-star review, or the Tim and Mick's publisher will be after you. Thanks for joining us and taking the time out of your evening, your precious time with us. We really appreciate it. So thank you very much.
And forgive me for my interruptions. Thank you very much.
No, nothing to be forgiven for. Thank you.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure. Keep doing good things. You're doing a belting job. Keep it going.
Thank you.
Right.
Thanks,
Thanks,
Mick.
gents. Thank you.
Cheers.
Bye then.
Cheers.